Okay, so now what we need to do is create a guest user login form or a guest user form. And we're going to put that in our account forms because it makes more sense to be with the account than anywhere else, mainly because it's associated to what accounts would potentially be in the future. So inside of our forms, it's going to be fairly easy. We're just going to say class, and it's going to be guest form, and it's forms.form, and just an email field. That's it. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's go back into our cart in our checkout home, and let's bring in that form as well. Guest form, and we'll say guest form equals to guest form. Okay, so with our guest form, we probably want to have an endpoint to actually handle this form. We can do it roughly the same as that login form, right? So this is where if we go back into our login view, we can actually pretty much copy this exact thing. I'm going to do that, and I'm just going to call this, instead of login page, we'll call this guest login view. Okay, and then again, it's going to take in that guest form and request post or none. Okay, and with this, we are really just going to say if form is valid, we want to get the guest ID itself. So that is, instead of having our guest's email, because that's what our guest form does, it just collects that email. Instead of having that in our session variables, what we want to do is actually bring it into being its own model. So inside of accounts, I'm going to come in here and just say class guest email, and it's going to be models.model. And we'll just really just have our email. So it'll be email equals to models.email field. And I'll put the timestamp stuff. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy these things from our billing profile. And I'm going to bring these things in. Okay, cool. So we've got our guest email, and define str self, and then we're just going to return self.email. Okay, so we've got that. And then I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my settings.py has accounts. It does. So let's run migrations. And python manage.py, make migrations. And then python manage.py, migrate. Okay. So back into that view, we've got that guest form. We'll still keep the next related stuff here. Now we just need to do email equals to form.cleanedData.get email. And the rest of this stuff I probably don't really need. I can use the redirects though. So I'm going to get rid of the login, authentication, all that stuff. I will have these redirects in here. And then I also want to go from .models, import guest. And I think we called it guest email. So guest email, we want to bring that in as well, just to store it in our database. So now we'll say new guest email equals to guest email.objects.create email equals to email. And then we are going to put that ID into our session variable. So we'll do request.session, and we'll just say guest email ID equals to new guest.id. Okay. And no matter what, this guest login, redirect, all this stuff probably shouldn't even have its own page. So instead of returning redirect or returning the rendering of the login, I'll just redirect them to login or maybe to register. Just do that. So if it works out, then we'll have them go into register. If it doesn't work out, it'll go into register. Otherwise, we'll have that guest email ID. So basically, we're storing this into our database to make sure we have it. And then once we have it, we can actually use this request session email ID back into our view here. So the next part of this is we'll say guest email ID equals to request.session.get. And then we'll say else, well, elif guest email ID is not none. So that means that if the user's authenticated, this is the billing profile we're using. Period. End of story. If the user is not authenticated and they have the guest email ID, then what can we do? Well, we can do the same thing all over again. So billing profile guest, billing guest profile, or billing guest, yeah, we'll leave it billing guest profile created. And this time it's going to be based off of the, the guest email. So I have to bring that in, and from accounts.models, import guest email. And this will be guest email obj equals to guest email.objects.get ID equals to guest email ID. And then finally, get or create will just get that guest email ID. So guest email object.email. Otherwise, we're probably going to have to raise some sort of error. Or maybe not actually, but we'll just pass it for now. Okay, so we have the two abilities to do this now. So we have our login form and our guest form, and it's just slightly different. Okay, so there's one more thing I need to do, and that is changing my form action. So right here, the action goes to login, and I'm just going to call this, well, let's go ahead and say if action URL, then we'll do action URL. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and do login URL. Okay. And mainly because our login URL actually exists. Like that's a real view that we can go to. And I did this for a specific reason, because now if we go back into our checkout, I can come in here, grab this, bring in continue as guest, and the action URL now will have to equal to that new endpoint or view that we created. And again, the login one, I don't have to change it because it's already there. So this one is going to have to go in. Let's grab our view itself, the guest login view. I'm going to bring it into my e-commerce URLs. We're going to import that one in. And I'm just going to do login /guest, or rather, let's do register /guest, because if they go there and they don't have this other stuff, it's going to go back to register. So register guest. This should probably be guest register view, but that's okay. We'll just call it. We'll keep it in as the. Actually, no. Let's leave it. Let's actually call it guest register view. That is definitely more robust as to what it is. So coming back, it's not really a login view. It's a guest register view. Okay, so just some slight changes there. Okay, cool. So now we've got our URL, and we also have an endpoint here. So let's go back into our checkout view. And we are going to have to use a variable here. So we'll say URL guest register as guest register URL. We just have to do that, so then we can pass it in to this snippet here. Okay, so we say because basically you can't put this in here. You can't do stuff like that. So you have to put it in as its own variable. Now you could pass this in as context to the view as well, but this will work fine, or it should work fine. Okay, let's look at our terminal. I don't have errors right now. I've made a bunch of changes, so hopefully it works. Let's go ahead and log out of here and go to our products, create a new product, add a cart, checkout. I've now have two of them. Unfortunately, this is not the right form, so the form should be guest form. We'll save that and refresh. The guest form is not actually showing the correct stuff. So let's go ahead and see why. Let's make sure our guest form is saved. Let's make sure our guest form is being rendered. It is. Okay, so I refresh. It's still not coming through. Let's see why. We've got our form here. That's fine. Let's go back into our checkout and let's see what's going on with our guest form here. And perhaps the context is actually not in. So let's go back into our URLs. And of course, yes, it's not in this context. So next thing, guest form, save that and refresh. And now there we go. So I'm going to just test one. I'll do abc123@gmail.com and I'll hit submit. Takes me to checkout. Really good sign. I refresh in here. I'm still not logged in. Also a good sign, right? So if I go back into my admin and let's go ahead and log in, and we don't actually even have our guest profile. So let's bring it into our admin. So from .models, import guest email, admin.site.register, guest email. We save that, refresh into our accounts. We've got our guest email there. Okay, great. So what happens if we logged out, or I logged in. I did some things that might cause some issues anyway. But for now, let's go ahead and just look at it this way. I'm not logged in. I go in to view, add to cart, checkout, continue as guest abc111@gmail.com. I hit submit. What do you know? It's there. So I'm going to have to refresh, log back in, and there it is. And if I log back, refresh into this checkout, what am I continuing in as, right? Well, hopefully you already know, but we would come in. Let's go back into our orders. The checkout view, not our orders, right here. What it should do is actually give us the billing profile for our authenticated user. As soon as I refresh that page, that's the billing profile that it's associated to then. So it potentially could have some issues with our order object in general. So that's where our order, we're probably not going to create it until after we create our billing profile. Because once we create our billing profile and then associate the cart to our order, then we might have some different things happening for us, which we'll see very soon. But now we have two different ways on actually going forward. I realize this actual view is getting very more or less convoluted, right? It's starting to build a lot of stuff. So eventually we'll probably have to change how a lot of these things work. But we're going to stick along this until we get it right. Once we get it right, then we can improve it to make sure that all of this whole process is just a lot better. So stay with us.